For the most wild yet most homely narrative which I am about to pen, I neither expect nor solicit belief. Mad indeed would I be to expect it, in a case where my very senses reject their own evidence. Mockingly, Edgar Allan Poe uses these two sentences to begin his well-known story The Black Cat, using an introductory technique for a story which is known and adapted by famous writers like King or Lovecraft, who also is referring Poe in his novels, making Poe a part of his stories as well. But Poe did not invent this way of introducing the reader to the story, and if it was not a cliché then, it is certainly by now. A homely narrative. A narrative like we have heard a million times, yet refreshing and new. I said mockingly, because as I read the short story, I had the feeling Poe would like not only to frighten the reader, but like Brecht, who would make the spectator aware of the circumstances that they were watching a play to engage them in the questioning of structure. Poe does the same with his writing and the structure of story. Hereafter, perhaps some intellect may be found which will reduce my phantasm to the commonplace. Some intellect more calm, more logical, and far less excitable than my own, which will perceive in the circumstances I detail with awe nothing more than an ordinary succession of natural causes and effects. Sure, the narrator is talking about the following events, which he is about to depict. But at the same time I feel like Poe is writing about people like the French philosopher Roland Barthes, who even uses one of Poe's stories in his essay towards a structural analysis of narrative. Not necessarily to explain the phantasms of the narrator, but to explain the system behind narrative itself. So, let's deep dive into Barthes and Poe to understand how narrativity is formed. Little disclaimer. This video will be part of a small series, mainly focusing on explaining the work of Barthes in his essay towards a structural analysis of narrative. Barthes focuses on all kinds of media in his work, hence the title Image, Music, Text, which discussed a variety of media phenomenon. For now, what is more important is his approach to the structural analysis of narrative, which shares one important question with other fields of study. What is the smallest unit in the field? In physics we would think of atoms or quarks. Barthes' approach, and here's the second thing to keep in mind, was a linguistic approach. And for his linguistic analysis of narrative, there's no way to work empirical and developing a theory out of the data later on. According to Barthes, there's just too much data to cover, because of the ubiquity of narrative in every culture and language. That's why he chooses to work the other way around, developing a theory first. Barthes bases his assumptions on a few shared attributes, homologies, which led him to argue out of a linguistic perspective instead of a literary perspective, because as simple as it is, a narrative is always a sentence. Structurally, narrative shares the characteristics of the sentence without ever being reducible to the simple sum of its sentences. A narrative is a long sentence, just as every consecutive sentence in a way is a rough outline of a short narrative. The theory of levels, on the other hand, points towards a structural hierarchy, which all parts of units fall into and gain meaning through it. Basically, he argues grammar or phonetics are perfectly explainable on their own, but it does not mean anything to have a grammatical structure. It only means something, how I structure a sentence, when I have an idea of what I want to say. What? Exactly. Thinking about language can be mind-boggling very quickly, because we do it apparently instinctive. Yet it is a technique ingrained by our social circle to communicate. Barthes himself uses the story Purloined Letter from Poe to explain the theory of levels. In the Purloined Letter, Poe gives an acute analysis of the failure of the chief commissioner of the Paris police, powerless to find the letter. His investigations, says Poe, were perfectly within the sphere of his speciality. He searched everywhere, saturated entirely the level of the police search, But in order to find the latter protected by its conspicuousness, it was necessary to shift to another level, to substitute the concealer's principle of relevance for that of the policeman. We know the structure. Now we have to come back to the question of the smallest unit. Like matter is built out of different kinds of subatomic particles forming an atom, the hierarchy of narrative language is built out of the narrative equivalent of subatomic particles, narrative functions. And like those particles, there are different kinds of narrative functions. These can be seen as the lower levels of the hierarchy, which are entwined in relations to each other. Those relations are called distributional and integrational. The first one is exactly like Poe described earlier, nothing more than an ordinary succession of very natural causes and effects. Barth called them functions, which will inevitably make this video way too confusing. For the sake of the video, keep in mind that when I'm talking about functions, I'm talking about distributional functions. I think the best way to understand these is by using an example. Early within the story of the Black Cat, the narrator confesses his first bloody act against his own cat named Pluto. I took from my waistcoat pocket a penknife, opened it, grasped the poor beast by the throat and deliberately cut one of its eyes from the socket. I blush, I shudder, while I pen the damnable atrocity. Those two sentences are filled with several functions. One of them is called cardinal function, nuclei. Those are the heart of every story and have to fulfill two criteria. They have to be chronological and logical. Chronological in time and logical by a nature of cause and effect. To put it simple, they need to have consequence. Another way to find those is to ask, when I happen to change them, is there an alteration in the story? When we categorize a function as cardinal, we also have to keep in mind that they are always part of a higher logical succession. Sequences, so to speak. So let's name this sequence. How about harming, because he seriously harms the cat? Okay, now we can break down the first sentence. I would suggest the cardinals of arming and butchering, but we can even go further and break them down to smaller units. Arming himself with the penknife, he first takes it out and then opens it. So we have taking and opening. The second part can be broken down in a similar fashion. First, he grasps the cat, then he cuts out the eye. So he is grasping and cutting. Okay, those are our cardinal functions. Barth also calls them the risky moves. This is because at every point there could be a different outcome in succession, which is creating the imaginative freedom of the writer within a narrative. The narrator could have taken the knife, opened it, grasped the cat and then let the knife slip out of his hand. We would have created a whole new character, one that shows remorse, guilt and sympathy. The second type of function is the catalyzer. The catalyzer lacks one of the criteria for cardinal functions, thus it is only chronological. Let's look at the second sentence of our example. This sentence has no consequence in terms of what we have talked about earlier. It's just a chronological succession. The narrator could still do any of the things he is doing in the sentence, or not mention them at all. It would cause no trouble in the sentences before or after. But those catalyzers are far from being useless. Now you may think about it in terms of atmosphere, character building, etc. But we are still on the lowest level of our hierarchy. We are talking about distributional functions, which are horizontal in effect. Those functions are instead a useful tool to control tempo, or as a storyteller would put it, pacing. By using catalyzers, you delay the next cardinal, bringing the reader to the edge of their seat, at least if they are invested. Suspense is also created by the well-structured interplay of cardinals and catalyzers. As an example, I broke down the most important cardinals and a few catalyzers of Inglourious Basterds' first scene. As you may know, the character of Landa is investigating the whereabouts of a Jewish family while they hide under the floor. Only moments after seeing the Jews hiding, the Cardinal of Landa leaving is hinted at. The movie is now delaying the next Cardinal of Landa by using various catalyzers, drinking, chatting, etc. Finally, the tension is released through the following Cardinal, although it is not the Cardinal of leaving. Not yet. Again, suspense itself is like grammar on its own. You can explain what it is, but it does not mean anything without the higher levels, action and narration. So let's get to the functions which are still on the functional level, but highly dependent on those higher levels, indices. Barth calls those indices informants and indices. Ah, damn you Bards, why are you using the same word twice for different things? Just putting lines in the front and the end will not help me to explain the damn thing. I will call indices hints for the purpose of this video, and indices just indices. So, indices are what Barth calls the integrational functions, the vertical ones, speaking in terms of hierarchy, while informants relate to pure data, for example the location or the time. Hints are relating to the psychology, character, philosophy or atmosphere. Barth would speak about implied signifieds, borrowing from linguistics. Basically, the signified is the level of content, while the signifiers are the level of structure, so keep that in mind. For now, let's jump back to the story of the black cat. Pluto, this was the cat's name, was my favorite pet and playmate. I alone fed him and he attended me wherever I went about the house. It was even with difficulty that I could prevent him from following me through the streets. We can already identify the first part as an informant, except the name itself, because everyone with a knowledge of the Roman pantheon would recognize the name of the cats as the same as Hades, god of the underworld himself, and could possibly come to the conclusion that something seems odd. The next few lines are the sole hint to the relation between the cat and his owner. The last sentence is of greater importance, because it correlates to a point of significance later in the story. The cat survives the first damnable atrocity, only to taunt his owner with its new appearance. So, on another intoxicated night, for what disease is like alcohol, he hangs the cat in the tree of his garden. And guess what is stalking the man after another night in the streets? Another black cat. The narrator makes the resemblance to Pluto perfectly clear though. You may have noticed that parts of the sentences we analyzed have more than one function. Especially psychological novels like this are highly indicing, creating a multitude of indicing functions. Different literary genres like fairy tales would be highly functional, which does not mean all functions, but cardinals and catalyzer heavy. On a scale it would look like this. At one point Barth wrote, "Art is a system which is pure. No unit ever goes wasted." And it is certainly by this approach. The last thing I would like to touch on is the relation between the different functions. As I have mentioned earlier, there are two types, the integrational and the distributional. But more concrete we can say, informants and indices combine freely as seen in the description of Pluto. Catalyzers and cardinals are linked through implication, because a catalyzer always implies that there is a cardinal. A catalyzer is somewhat parasitic and cannot exist without a cardinal. Cardinals, on the other hand, can exist on their own. And as seen in the sequences discussing the harming of Pluto, cardinals always call for other cardinals. The next video is all about action, which is the second level of the narrative hierarchy of Barth and will include the attention model of Grammars. Speaking of action, like and subscribe. Thank you for watching and stay tuned.